Dominating the center immediately, this pawn claims crucial central squares and prepares for rapid development. Preparing for a flexible pawn structure, this defends the central square and opens diagonals for future piece development. Immediately contesting central territory, white aims to seize space and restrict black's options. Developing a knight to its most natural square now prepares for queenside expansion and potential. D5 challenges. Fortifying the center and preparing for kingside development, this knight proactively shapes the early pawn structure's strategic landscape. Black immediately challenges white's central control, aiming for an active pawn structure and potential queenside counterplay. Establishing central presence while preparing for aggressive knight development. Capturing the pawn immediately re-establishes central symmetry, but opens lines where white's pieces can soon become active. Recapturing the pawn here establishes a robust central presence, setting the stage for potential queenside pressure by clearing the d-file. Developing the knight to c6 actively contests central pawns and prepares for an assault on white's central structure. Unleashing a fianchettoed bishop early, white aims to seize control of the long, dark-squared diagonal, potentially pressuring black's queenside and creating attacking chances. Black solidifies the pawn structure and prepares to develop the king's bishop, aiming to connect the rooks and achieve a more harmonious setup. Trading the knight on c6 opens up the d-file for black's rook and potentially creates a pawn majority in the center, offering long-term play on the queenside. Reclaiming the pawn with the b-pawn opens a diagonal for the queen and bishop, but it also doubles black's pawns on the c-file, creating a lasting structural weakness that white can target. This exchange sacrifices pawn structure for piece activity, a trade-off that requires careful navigation in the ensuing middle game. Solidifying the kingside structure aims to prepare for potential fianchetto, creating a defensive shield while simultaneously looking to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal, thereby improving the pawn structure's robustness. Solidifying the pawn structure after the exchange on c6, black now calmly develops the bishop to its natural square, preparing to castle and connect the rooks, all while subtly challenging white's control of the central dark squares. Solidifying central control and preparing for kingside expansion, this develops a key piece to a natural square that supports the pawn chain and eyes the queenside structure. Opening the center with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's harmonious piece development and create immediate counterplay, potentially freeing black's queenside pawns and developing new attacking avenues. Securing the king's safety now allows for a more confident development of the remaining pieces and a clearer plan to exploit the doubled pawns. Casting the king to safety secures that vital piece, a fundamental building block for future operations and a prudent response to the opening's rapid development. The queen now boldly aims for the queenside, creating immediate pressure on the c6 pawn and implicitly challenging black's queenside pawn structure, which is already compromised by the doubled pawns after bxc6. This aggressive posture forces black to consider how to defend this vulnerable point without creating further weaknesses or hindering their development, potentially leading to a dynamic imbalance where white has the initiative. Unveiling an unexpected counterthrust, the queen repositions to **qb6**, a bold declaration that challenges white's central control and simultaneously prepares to exploit the lingering weakness on the b2 square. This is not merely a defense of the d6 pawn, but a proactive strike, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and introduce immediate complications where none were anticipated. Observe how this seemingly simple relocation of a major piece injects a dose of tactical urgency into what was shaping up as a positional duel, forcing white to confront threats rather than continue their planned expansion. The pressure is now on white to react, to demonstrate why their central pawns and knight outposts were worth the sacrifice of the bishop pair, or face the consequences of a rapidly shifting battlefield. Establishing control over the open c-file with the rook, this maneuver prepares to exert pressure on black's queenside pawns, especially the potentially weak c6 pawn, while simultaneously offering a degree of protection to white's own d4 square and potential future advances. An audacious gambit, This capture plunges black into a dangerous, materially unbalanced position, sacrificing pawn structure for speculative initiative, and immediately brings white's queen into a potent attacking posture on the open queenside file that will demand black's undivided attention. Recapturing the pawn on c6 instantly severs black's pawn structure, creating isolated queenside pawns and a compromised defensive setup, while simultaneously opening the c-file for potential pressure. Answering the queenside structural vulnerability, black repositions the bishop to prepare for potential exchanges and centralize activity, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns white now possesses on the c-file after the recent pawn grab, while simultaneously reinforcing the center and potentially opening lines for the rooks. The queen boldly ventures deep into enemy territory, a daring raid aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create immediate threats against the c6 pawn. This aggressive positioning forces black to react, potentially sacrificing material or weakening their king's defense to regain material balance. Initiating a powerful central pawn push, black now seeks to exploit the open lines created by the previous exchanges. This dramatic pawn sacrifice opens the c-file, intending to create dynamic play against white's king and potentially disrupt white's coordination. The immediate aim is to engage the queen and activate the rook for a more active role in the game. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, while eyeing the vulnerable black king, is the priority here. Reclaiming the pawn offers crucial central influence, yet the queen's repositioning introduces a touch of vulnerability, demanding careful watch over potential tactical jabs aimed at its temporary outpost. Simplifying the material offers a clear path towards a potentially favorable endgame for white, as the doubled pawns on the queenside for black are a long-term structural weakness that will be easier to exploit with fewer pieces on the board. The doubled pawns on the b-file, though a potential weakness, now provide a critical outpost for the knight on c6 and anchor the queenside pawn structure, preparing for a potential queenside expansion later in the game by black. Clearing the central tension now that the queens are off the board shifts the focus entirely to controlling the open files and exploiting the structural weaknesses. Embracing the open file now dominates black's agenda, a calculated risk that sacrifices queenside pawn integrity for potential activity on the c-file. Exposing the weakened dark squares around black's monarch with this capture significantly simplifies the game, potentially leading to a favorable pawn structure for white in the ensuing endgame. Reclaiming the bishop solidifies black's central pawn majority, creating a promising structure with potential for future advances, while simultaneously addressing the immediate pressure on the d5 pawn and opening lines for piece activity. Sacrificing the knight here opens up the central files and pressures black's rather exposed king, while simultaneously freeing your pieces for a more dynamic attack. Developing the bishop to d8 secures its protection and prepares for a potential rerouting to the kingside, seeking active squares and aiming to dislodge white's central pawn structure. Opening the c-file now forces black to commit their bishop, creating a clear target and centralizing white's rooks for potential action on the newly opened thoroughfare. Recapturing the rook with the bishop immediately addresses the immediate tactical threat, but it also solidifies white's central pawn majority and opens the file for potential future pressure. Consider the long-term consequences of this pawn structure. Black's queenside pawns are now isolated and will require careful defense as the game progresses into what will likely be a strategic endgame. Initiating the rook to the b-file aims to exploit the newly opened diagonal and put pressure on black's weakened queenside pawn structure, potentially forcing further concessions or creating tactical targets. Re-establishing the central pawn tension after the exchange is paramount, and repositioning the bishop to support the advance creates a solid structure for black, eyeing the weak b-pawn and potential central breakthroughs. Pushing the pawn now establishes a foothold on the queenside, potentially restricting black's bishop and creating a useful outpost for a rook if the opportunity arises, while also preparing to advance it further to secure space and hem in black's pieces. Black liberates the bishop, finally tidying up the pawn structure and activating the piece, but this comes at the cost of relinquishing the central pawn majority, a significant concession in this potentially protracted endgame. Capturing the bishop on d5 with your own bishop now reestablishes equality in material and simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the isolated d-pawn black will soon face. This exchange also opens the file for your rook, potentially creating pressure on black's queen side. Reclaiming the square occupied by the bishop on c7 asserts presence in the center and prepares for pawn advances or piece redeployment, aiming to solidify black's central pawn structure against white's potential kingside pressure. Reclaiming the open file, white aims to solidify central control and prepare for potential pawn advances, subtly nudging the game towards a more positional struggle where maneuvering and precise piece placement will be paramount. The bishop now finds a comfortable outpost on d6, eyeing the weak pawns on the queen side and preparing to join the fight for the central squares, potentially supporting a future advance of the pawn or simply reinforcing the kingside defense. Asserting dominion over the critical central squares, the rook's advance on the 6th rank immediately tightens the noose around black's weakened queenside pawn structure, forcing a positional concession and initiating a strategic endgame battle where white aims to exploit the isolated pawn. A thoughtful repositioning of the rook. This aims to challenge white's imposing battery on the c-file and potentially force a simplification that could ease black's somewhat cramped position. Opening up the e-file creates an immediate avenue for potential pawn breakthroughs or piece exchanges, directly impacting the central pawn structure and offering a fresh attacking angle. Relocating the king to f8 now solidifies the central pawn structure and prepares for potential rook activity on the d-file, while simultaneously tucking the monarch away from any immediate diagonal threats from white's remaining pieces. Safeguarding the monarch becomes paramount now, as the king subtly shifts from the center's potential crossfire towards a more protected corner. Solidifying the kingside structure and preparing for potential pawn advances, g6 aims to secure the king's immediate vicinity and potentially enable a later fianchetto for the bishop, creating a more robust defensive setup against white's encroaching pieces. The capture of the b-pawn creates an immediate imbalance on the board. White secures a material advantage, but at the cost of opening a dangerous semi-open file for black's rook, which now gains a foothold on the queen side. Black boldly challenges white's central pawn structure, seeking to inject life into the position and create counterplay. The pawn push aims to snag that isolated b6 pawn and further restrict black's already cramped queenside, potentially opening a path for the rook to exploit the open a file if it becomes accessible. Unleashing the pawn on e4 dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating an open file for black's rook and potentially weakening white's king's safety by exposing the f-file. The pawn structure now solidifies. The bishop immediately recaptures, aiming to maintain its activity on the open diagonal and contest the crucial d-file that will soon become central to the unfolding endgame struggle, preventing black from establishing a dominant central presence. Reclaiming the initiative, black re-anchors the bishop, preparing to contest the open central files and prevent white's pawns from advancing further. Asserting control over the 7th rank, the rook infiltrates black's position, aiming to restrict the bishop's mobility and potentially create passed pawns on the queenside later. Grabbing that pawn with the bishop opens a complex positional battle, fundamentally altering the endgame's character by creating an immediate imbalance of material, though this pawn grab, while tempting, often leads to the king's pawn structure being permanently weakened by the subsequent pawn advance. Suddenly, the seemingly passive rook has found a path to exploit the exposed enemy monarch, aiming to overwhelm its defenses and create decisive threats. The rook tucks back, activating itself on the open d-file and preparing to contest control alongside the white rook. This maneuver aims to exploit the potential for counterplay on the queen side. As the passed, a pawn will eventually become a target, and the rook can provide crucial defensive support or initiate an exchange to simplify the position and improve its own king's safety. The rook's repositioning to the 7th rank injects immediate pressure, aiming to exploit the precarious pawn structure on black's queenside and potentially infiltrate further into enemy territory by targeting the weakened b6 pawn. The bishop repositions, eyeing the now less defended b6 square, a subtle attempt to consolidate pieces and prepare for a more active role in the unfolding endgame struggle, even if it means sacrificing some immediate attacking potential. Initiating pawn expansion on the king side now, f4 aims to secure the knight and potentially open avenues for further offensive action or to shore up the monarch's defenses against potential checks. Bringing the king into active play, this seeks to leverage the open lines and create counterplay. A daring consolidation as the king steps into a more active, if somewhat exposed, position, aiming to shield the remaining pawns and potentially support an offensive thrust. Reclaiming the open files is paramount for black, and relocating the rook to the d-file offers immediate counterplay, threatening the vulnerable pawn structure and potentially forcing white's king into a more exposed position as the material continues to dwindle. Pioneering advancement on the king side seeks to establish a fortress for the monarch amidst this increasingly open terrain, potentially setting up a phased advance of the pawns to gain breathing room. Finally, black repositions the bishop, eyeing the weakened pawn structure on white's queen side and preparing to activate it along the long diagonal should the opportunity arise, aiming to exploit the somewhat exposed white king as the game transitions toward an endgame. The king ventures into the fray, seeking shelter behind the pawn phalanx, yet exposes itself to potential disruptions in the center. Pivoting the bishop to the diagonal to eye the weakened kingside pawns, while also creating a potential escape square on f8 should the a5 pawn become a problem. The rook surges forward, aiming to disrupt the enemy king's sanctuary and sow disarray in the weakened queenside pawns. The rook's repositioning to the b-file aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay, although the immediate pressure on the 7th rank is released. Pushing the rook to the 7th rank immediately creates immense pressure on black's kingside pawns, aiming to split the defense and potentially exploit weaknesses around the exposed black king. Reclaiming the open file is a sound objective for the rook, aiming to contest white's established control and disrupt their attacking plans. Sensing an opportunity to restrict the opponent's pieces, black repositions their rook to the center, aiming to disrupt white's pawns and potentially create counterplay. Bringing the king closer to the center promises to be a proactive step in preparing for the endgame, as it can now participate more actively in defending pawns or even spearheading an attack on the queenside pawns. Reclaiming the initiative, white advances the h-pawn, aiming to create an immediate threat against black's monarch and potentially open lines for an attack that was previously stalled by black's well-placed pieces. Capturing the pawn with the king is a desperate attempt to create a passed pawn, but it exposes the monarch to further threats and abandons the protection of important squares. The rook now reclaims its central position, menacingly overlooking black's weakened king side and offering support to white's pawns as they advance towards the promotion square. The rook's repositioning to the 6th rank creates a fascinating dual threat, potentially supporting a pawn advance on the king side while simultaneously eyeing a future breakthrough on the d-file if the white king decides to wander. Activating the bishop to harass the opposing king with increased pressure and potentially creating discovered attacks seems to be the immediate goal, aiming to exploit any weaknesses in the pawn structure. Shifting the king's gaze towards the queen side offers a subtle attempt to escape the pressure building on the king side, though it leaves the monarch somewhat exposed to potential advances from the powerful rook. Reshaping the attack, the rook advances, aiming to stir up play on the king side and capitalize on any lingering weaknesses in black's defensive setup. A surprising retreat, sacrificing precious pawn structure for a defensive setup, hoping to bog down the rooks on the 7th rank. The monarch is finally forced from its cozy corner, creating a delightful disruption in the defensive structure. The king's retreat to g7 feels like a hesitant step back, potentially allowing white's rook further dominion over the 7th rank and tightening the noose around black's remaining pawns. Driving the black king further into that corner under threat of check is a masterful way to restrict its mobility. A patient repositioning, the black king retreats, preparing to anchor itself defensively behind the pawn chain, a necessary consolidation amidst this endgame's intricate pawn structure and potential threats. Exploring the king's advanced position for potential weaknesses now, rather than a premature attack. Shifting the rook from the 7th rank allows it to participate more actively on the king side, potentially creating mating threats or reinforcing a central pawn push. Activating the rook on the queen side aims to disrupt black's now consolidated structure and potentially create passed pawns. Initiating a pawn push with the rook now frees the king from its protective pawn chain, potentially inviting tactical complications as it ventures further up the board. Harnessing the open files, this king maneuver aims to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and potentially launch a dangerous pawn push with the f-file now clear for infiltration. A strategic repositioning, aiming to influence the d6 pawn from a more active square and potentially prepare for exchanges that simplify the position into a favorable endgame for black. Pushing this pawn opens a path to potentially create a passed pawn on the king side, a crucial advantage in this endgame where material is relatively balanced and the kings are becoming more active. Assessing the situation, black's bishop now repositions, eyeing the king side and creating potential threats. Forcing the black king to retreat and clearing a path for the rook to dominate the 7th rank, potentially setting up a mating net. The monarch's desperate scramble towards the queen side now looks less like a strategic retreat and more like a panicked flight from an ever-advancing enemy, with each square on that side becoming a potential trap. King's safety becomes paramount as the check forces the opposing monarch to the edge, opening avenues for decisive attacks. Relocating the monarch to the relative safety of the central files, while seemingly passive, allows for a more flexible response to white's probing rook, preparing to defend against potential pawn advances or even to initiate counterplay should the opportunity arise. Harnessing the initiative, advancing the passed pawn further into enemy territory, creating a dangerous passed threat that forces black to dedicate precious material to its containment and potentially opens lines for white's remaining pieces to penetrate. The discovered check offers a fleeting moment of hope, a desperate attempt to stir up activity and perhaps force a blunder, but the unleashed monarch remains exposed and vulnerable behind the thin shield of its pawn. King activation, a crucial endgame principle, takes center stage as the monarch ventures forward to support the advancing pawn and potentially participate in the coming skirmishes. The bishop repositions to d2, a somewhat passive retreat, yet it prevents the g-pawn from advancing further on its own and prepares to support the king should it be forced to flee its current shelter. The white king's advance, now supported by the rook's threat of a discovered attack across the board, aims to seize the initiative and put the black king under immense pressure, forcing a desperate defense. Black's king, now exposed on the 5th rank, finds itself under immediate threat as white's rook prowls for entry. Maintaining this defensive posture is critical to preventing further infiltration. The rook's repositioning to flank the enemy king creates an immediate tactical threat, forcing black to dedicate resources to defense rather than advancing their own initiative. The opponent's king, trapped and utterly defenseless, succumbs to the beautifully coordinated assault.